Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monde Muyango, and I'm the director of the Africa program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And we're absolutely delighted to be able to partner with USAID and the other partners on this very, very important launch of this report on civil society, the endurance test, civil society adaptation in uncertain environments. We welcome you to the discussion, and to kick things off, let me please welcome Ms. Mariam Afrasiabi, USAID Center for Excellence on Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance, to offer some remarks. Mariam?
Thank you so much. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mariam Afrasiabi again. I'm a senior civil society advisor in USAID Center of Excellence on Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance, also known as the DRG Center. So it doesn't require a panel of experts or 4 regional reports to identify 2016 as a tumultuous year. In many countries, civil society actors had to contend with conflict, natural disaster, and massive population displacement. Civil society leaders had to navigate unpredictable environments marked by a wave of democratic backsliding that swept the world as both state and non-state actors constricted civic and political space. But while those conditions were obvious, the Civil Society Organization Sustainability Index, or CSOSI, introduces both micro and macro level insights obscured by the noise of daily news cycles. One of the index's greatest strengths is its breadth, annually tracking trends in nearly 70 countries globally. One of the index's, the combined reports, are a reminder of the need for nuance, as even neighboring countries can have radically different trend lines. The index's wide lens, however, also reveals common regional and global trends that can only be seen through broad comparative analysis. Despite 2016's volatility, this year's CSOSI reports also revealed how civil society actors found common approaches to adapt to new conditions, leveraging technology, new organizational models, and flexible tactics to endure and thrive in many times very challenging ecosystems. CSOSI was first developed by USAID in 1997 for the emerging democracies of the Europe and Eurasia region, and extended to cover sub-Saharan Africa in 2009, the Middle East and North Africa, or the MENA region, in 2011, and Asia in 2014. So the 2016 reports covered a total of 69 countries globally. CSOSI serves as an important resource regarding civil society trends across regions, so comparatively, but also over time, longitudinally. It is used by local CSOs to undertake assessment and analysis of the CSO sector in their countries, to increase their capacity, as well as to engage in policy dialogue with their governments and the private sector. The quotes that were and are still running on the monitors as you entered the room are just a snapshot of how CSOSI is being used on the ground by our local CSO actors and their partners in the regions. Before I go further, I want to thank the Keynote Institute of the Woodrow Wilson Center for hosting the event and for the work they do to build mutual understanding, cooperation, and exchange among intellectual and opinion leaders in the United States, Russia, Ukraine, and the surrounding states. Specifically, I would like to thank Matt Rojansky, director of the Keynote Institute at the Wilson Center, for his willingness to co-host this event, Dr. Monde Muyango, director of the Africa program, for agreeing to moderate, John Fleming and Deborah Carey at the Wilson Center, who did the legwork to help pull this event together. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank all of the individuals who contributed to the production of the CSOSI reports over the course of the last year. First and foremost, I want to thank our colleagues at Management Systems International, MSI, and the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, ICNL, who have worked to produce the CSOSI reports year after year, and the dozens of civil society organizations and representatives from each region that organize discussions, participate on panels, and draft country reports. These are the real grassroots producers and authors of CSOSI. They, of course, couldn't be here today, but they have been busy launching and discussing the CSOSI in their own countries. Thanks to the experts who review country reports for quality and consistency and participate in sub-regional editorial committees, which are held here in Washington, D.C., we're very lucky to have 2 of our regional experts on the panel this afternoon. Lastly, many thanks to the USAID regional bureaus for their financial and technical contributions to the various indices and to USAID's missions in the 69 countries covered by the index for their technical engagement and on-the-ground expertise. The CSOSI is a truly intra-agency effort within USAID, which, as you all know, is no simple task in our bureaucracy at times. I'll quickly go over the agenda for the afternoon. Following my remarks, we are fortunate to have Gretchen Burkle, Deputy Assistant Administrator of USAID's Bureau for Europe and Eurasia, to give today's keynote speech. Gretchen has more than 25 years of leadership and management experience, including 17 years working in international development specifically. She joined USAID in her current role as DAA for the E&E Bureau this past August, but she has long experience working in the US government. She previously served as a senior coordinator in the Department of State's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor from 2004 to 2006, and as a board representative to the interagency process for the Millennium Challenge Corporation. She has also worked with NGOs, serving both overseas and in Washington, D.C., headquarters with International Republican Institute, IRI, where she oversaw implementation of the Institute's first global initiatives on women and youth, served as chief of party in Kabul, Afghanistan, and served as director for Africa. Gretchen also worked in the US Congress from 1997 to 1999 as a legislative assistant to Senator Arlen Specter, where she covered foreign affairs, defense, and foreign operations appropriations subcommittees, and energy issues. I thank her for being here today. Following Gretchen's address, we will turn the floor over to an exciting panel of experts who will address the theme, Endurance Tests, Civil Society Adaptation in Uncertain Environments. Finally, we will end with a 30-minute Q&A session where we will get to hear from you. So with that, I turn the podium over to Gretchen for our keynote speech.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Miriam, for that very kind introduction. I'm really delighted to be here today, although this is my first opportunity participating in a launch of the Civil Society Sustainability Index. As Miriam mentioned, I have long followed issues related to civic participation and democratic development, and so it's a true honor to be here with the panel and with you all today. Thank you very much. Miriam mentioned I'm the new DAA in the Europe and Eurasia Bureau, working with an incredible team at AID, not only in our region, but around the world on civil society projects. Before joining USAID in the fall, I was very happy to spend many, many years working on democracy building and in that sector, so I feel very strongly about the importance of the role that civil society plays in supporting citizens and governments on their path to democracy. I know also that USAID Administrator Ambassador Mark Green strongly supports the positive role that civil society plays in helping countries advance their development goals and in building stronger democratic societies. This annual event offers us all an opportunity to reflect on the positive developments and the challenges in civil society that have taken place the previous year. It also serves as a forum to discuss how we, together, the US government, implementing partners, NGOs, citizen activists, all of us together can best support civil society organizations to pursue their goals and carry out their broader functions in democratic systems. Today, I want to highlight a few of the most notable trends in civil society that we report on in the past year and how we at USAID are adopting our modalities of assistance. So what are the 2016 reports showing us? For 20 years, the CSO Sustainability Index has been a critical monitoring tool for tracking the developments of civil society over time and informing the strategic priorities of local partners and governments, as well as the priorities of international donors. This year's reports provide evidence that the continued constraints, obstacles, and challenges confronting civil society are becoming even more widespread and complex. In the E&E region, for example, we continue to see wave after wave of legislation designed to restrict the work of independent civil society and activists. In Azerbaijan, the government continues to restrict independent voices and political freedoms, which resulted in countless organizations closing or reducing operations, and worse, self-censoring. We are seeing a more openly assertive Russia seeking to influence domestic processes to inhibit civic activity, both within Russia itself and also in the region more broadly. The Russian government's continued pressure on independent civic groups through implementation of legislation such as the Foreign Agents Registry Act and the Undesirable Foreign Organization listing has impacted organizations' abilities to access funding, advocate, maintain a positive reputation among citizens, and develop their own organizational capacities. What we are witnessing today, moreover, is a holistic attempt to polarize and stigmatize the independent civic sector, from misinformation and campaigns to discredit CSOs to draconian legislation and regulatory impediments that drastically reduce organizations' abilities to fund and operate. Perhaps most concerning for the E&E region, this year's reports highlight governments of EU member countries, countries where USAID no longer has a bilateral mission, but where they are adopting restrictive measures for civil society that mirror their less democratic neighbors. For example, EU member states such as Hungary and Poland experience greater decline in CSO sustainability as their governments further restricted the operating space of independent voices. Now, switching regions, in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, we are also seeing increasing restrictions on CSOs, as well as independent media, often in the name of national security, undermining the ability of organizations to advocate and operate. In Tanzania, the government has taken several actions limiting freedoms of expression and information, including passage of restrictive media legislation. And in Burundi, the reports narrate the civil society's relationship with the government is increasingly tense as CSOs are harassed and new legislation threatens the ability of organizations, including international NGOs, to operate without interference. Other factors inhibiting the work of CSOs are economic hardships made worse by drought and food insecurity that, along with conflict, are prohibiting the ability of CSOs to provide basic services for needy populations in such countries as South Sudan and Ethiopia. In the Middle East, for example, the reports also highlight that CSOs operate in a tumultuous environment where they face the pressure of working in areas of fierce armed conflicts to areas where there is severe humanitarian and economic crises. The Middle East region has contended with the ongoing civil war in Syria, for example, and the resulting movements of refugees and internally displaced persons, as well as continuous concerns about security and terrorism. Not surprisingly, in this time of war in Syria, CSOs were negatively impacted by both state and non-state actors who restrict CSO organizations and their work. For example, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria has impeded CSOs operating in and around areas under the group's control. While on the other hand, new laws and regulations aimed at countering extremist activities have simultaneously created new restrictions for civil society itself. So as we see, the reports highlight significant challenges. But now I'd like to shift gears a bit and look at where the 2016 narrative reports showcase continued widespread engagement and strong grassroots citizen activism around issues of local concern. And this is where I think there is much room for optimism. For example, in Macedonia, in the absence of adequate government response to the ongoing refugee crisis there, as well as several natural disasters, citizens quickly responded by organizing and providing humanitarian assistance and cleanup aid. In Ukraine, civil society activists are donating both their time and financial resources to charitable causes at significantly higher levels compared to previous years. In Jordan, CSOs are launching extraordinary effective advocacy campaigns against the unfair penal code. Citizens are advocating against domestic violence in Morocco and successfully pushing for the establishment of a department for children in Bangladesh. Citizen activists are promoting nonviolent elections in Benin and using social media to mobilize youth to demand affordable land in Namibia. So you can see there is a wide example of great success on the civil society front. I previously mentioned the difficulties organizations face in operating in conflict zones and under humanitarian crises. Yet, on a positive note, there are shining examples of CSOs doing extraordinary work under these difficult circumstances, of showing real resilience and innovation in responding to conflicts and humanitarian crises. Examples abound, but to name just a few, in Yemen, Iraq, Nepal, and Nigeria, CSOs are providing much needed services despite the logistical challenges associated with operating in conflict zones, post-natural disasters, or just navigating fragile, uncertain political environments. Of course, in many parts of the Middle East and Africa, and in Ukraine and the Eurasia region, CSOs are responding to the dire needs of the burgeoning population of IDPs and refugees. Decentralization processes in many countries also offer the potential to improve the relationship between citizens, civil society, and governments at the local level. The 2016 reports are also revealing that as domestic governments reduce state funding levels and restrict access to international funders, CSOs are generating resources through new, innovative financial tools to ensure their own financial stability. While still relatively nascent in most of the countries surveyed by the CSO Sustainability Index, domestic fundraising via online platforms, for example, represents a promising mechanism for promoting financial diversification and organizational stability. In sum, the reports show the impact of citizens around the world who are mobilizing around issues they consider to be a priority for themselves and for their communities. This grassroots activity, which is the cornerstone of so much progress in countries everywhere, is making a distinct difference in the lives of millions of people, and that is something to celebrate. I would like to turn my remarks now to how USAID will continue to support civil society and communities around the world. As the political and economic landscape in which civil society operates shifts, so too must our approach to assistance. Over the past several years, USAID has become increasingly flexible in the way we design, fund, and implement our programs. We recognize the need to strengthen our partnership base, both internationally and within the countries we operate. We also recognize the importance of empowering individuals and equipping them with the tools and skills necessary to address challenges within their communities and countries. USAID is increasingly relying on mechanisms such as broad agency announcements and co-creation, as well as grand challenges and other innovative procurement tools as a means to be less prescriptive and more responsive to the self-identified needs of civil society activists and organizations. Activists are best positioned to identify the specific needs and approaches to promote broad-based civil society developments within their own country. It is our job to support these activists and organizations where needed and show our solidarity, all of us together, when they feel cut off from the rest of the world. In closing, our 20 years worth of CSO Sustainability Index reports from the E&E region, as well as the more recent reports from Sub-Saharan Africa, MENA, and Asia, demonstrate that promoting sustainable civil society development is neither a short-term task nor a straightforward one. It requires strong partnership, trust, and tenacity. That is one of the reasons I am so appreciative of tools such as the CSO SI. It allows us to track our progress and setbacks over the long term, but it also helps us make well-informed and strategic decisions on how and where our assistance may be most effective. And now I am looking forward to hearing from some of the leading experts on civil society development and for a lively discussion on how we can continue and strengthen our work together. Thank you very much. And with that, I would like to turn the floor to Monde, who I've had the pleasure of working with before. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gretchen, and Ms. Afrasabi for giving us the background to the index, but also for doing such an excellent job of highlighting the key issues of concern. But for me personally, I think more importantly is that you identified opportunities for engagement to continue the progress and to grapple with some of those challenges that you highlighted. So thank you so much for doing an excellent job of setting the tone, highlighting the key issues, and giving our wonderful panel here some serious issues in which to sink their teeth and expertise into to offer us some recommendations for the way forward. So without taking up too much of your time, because I know you're all here because you're interested in this issue, you're committed to this issue, and many of you, as I look across the room, I see many people who've devoted their careers and lives to this particular space and this particular issue. So I'm not going to take up too much of your time except to introduce our speakers very quickly and then get into the substance of our discussions. So as mentioned earlier, we have a panel of 3 very knowledgeable speakers who will provide some more in-depth perspectives on these and other issues that we just raised. And I will very quickly introduce them by giving a brief summary of some of what they bring to the table so you understand a little bit where they're coming from, even as they respond to the issues and questions that have been raised. You can find their full bios in the program. So our first panelist is Alex Sada, who is the Chief Incubation Officer with Civicus, where he provides strategic planning and donor management to support data shift. Before joining Civicus, he led the Armenian National Committee, Western Region, and worked at Counterpart, where he engaged in local civil society groups from Honduras to Afghanistan, from Georgia to Senegal, to help build the next generation of civil and political leaders globally. And Alex and I just discovered that we have common Armenian heritage in, right?
Yes.
Absolutely, so it's wonderful to meet a fellow Armenian. All right. Our second panelist is Orisa Lusevich, who is manager of the Ukraine Forum in the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House in England, where she focuses on social change and the role of civil society in democratic transition in the post-Soviet region. She has deep expertise on the Ukraine, including authoring a chapter on civil society and reform in that country, but she has also published on civil society in Georgia and Moldova. Prior to Chatham House, she led the Europe House Georgia and was executive director of the Open Ukraine Foundation. She's also a senior regional expert for USAID's index, as was previously mentioned. Then our third panelist is Amy Hawthorne, who is the Deputy Director for Research with the Project on Middle East Democracy, and she brings to this discussion expertise and extensive policy, analytical, and practical experience on Arab political reform and democracy promotion. Prior to her current position, she served as a resident senior fellow of the Atlantic Council's Hariri Center for the Middle East, as an appointee at the U.S. Department of State, and as founding executive director of the Hollins Center for International Dialogue. She has lived and traveled extensively throughout the Middle East, especially Egypt and Turkey. Let me talk a little bit about the format of the event going forward. I'll ask each of our speakers a general question to sort of begin the discussion, and then I'll have 3 questions directed to each of them individually, and then a final closing question for them to offer some ideas and suggestions for the way forward. As I mentioned earlier, I know you all bring a lot of interest and commitment to this issue, so we will then have the moderated question and answer period that Mariam talked about in her opening remarks. So with that, let me start with the same question to each of our panel members. At the most basic level, civil society organization sustainability refers to the ways in which an organization can remain effective and persist over time. The concept of sustainability has evolved over time, however shaped by changing context and our evolving understanding of civil society. So I'd like to ask each of you to provide a working definition of civil society sustainability, and also offer your thoughts on the viability of civil society organizations in the environments in which they currently exist. Alex, I'll start with you first and then just roll down the table there.
Sure. Thank you very much, Dr. Kalustian.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to USAID and the Wilson Center. Before I get started, Miriam and I just returned from a working trip in Fiji, where we had, yeah, where this morning I was missing Fiji with the wind blowing here. So yes, where Civicus had its International Civil Society Week. It was being held, and one of the major takeaways from the week, from the discussions at every panel, was storytelling. The way we tell the story of what civil society is, what we do, and how our ability to do some of the most difficult, some of the most essential, and to deliver some of the most essential services to the most vulnerable is being threatened without using the jargon that we use in these rooms, and without making people feel like this is something in the abstract. And so, as we sit here this morning, our freedoms, civil society freedoms, citizen freedoms, the ability of citizens to act is being narrowed, it's being repressed. The FCC in the United States just repealed net neutrality rules. That is not just an American issue, it's a global issue, okay? Osman Kavala has been in prison for 42 days now. He's a businessman and a philanthropist in Turkey, and he's in prison for having supported cross-border peace initiatives. In Fiji, we had the chance to go to coastline rural communities where climate change is the cause of disappearing villages, livelihoods, and families, okay? And these are not places where you can build buildings on stilts, okay? So that's what civil society and civic space is, okay? Fijians not being able to organize themselves freely to make sure that refugees, that livelihoods, that children are able to survive what is happening to their country is closing civic space. So as we go through today's discussion, I would encourage all of us to think about what it means to see sustainability of CSOs, what it means to see civil society in a slightly different light, outside of our, perhaps outside of our heads and more in our hearts. With that said, CSO sustainability, as was said, the definition has evolved. Sustainability definition has evolved over the last 2 decades. And I remember when I first started working with the index, sustainability was most narrowly defined as financial sustainability, right? Financial viability. And while it is true that without the resources to deliver the work that CSOs need to deliver, there are no CSOs. We've come to understand, and our understanding of sustainability has also, based on the data that we're seeing, has also evolved. If at one point democracy was defined as broad brushstrokes, and later in the post 9/11 world, it was fine pencil lines that were creating democracies, small pieces of legislation, small victories. Today, we're at the brink of moving from broad brushstrokes in the fight against tyranny and repression to the fine pencil strokes, right? We have to dig deep into what it means for purpose to be sustained, right? And that's how I would define sustainability today, and that's how we're seeing the most successful efforts to organize communities and citizens to define sustainability. And I would say sustaining the organizing principle of citizens, of communities, is what sustainability is being defined as. Less about whether an NGO, a CSO, has the grant to do this, because what we're also seeing is that a young person, an old person, a mother with a cell phone, with a smartphone, is as strong and as potent in her aim and social purpose as is an entire organization, but does not have the same amount of money to run programs. And so we're seeing the traditional definition of sustainability really come apart and being reconstructed in various ways depending on context. In Africa, for the most part, what we are witnessing, and I invite you to look at Civicus Monitor, which is as close to a real-time reflection of civic space issues, civic space in all countries around the world. We're seeing that organizations who put purpose and mission and impact the way they define impact ahead of resource gathering and resource mobilization, which means they are working with mission-focused movements, with small numbers of activists, are actually seeing their own efforts, their own organizational missions sustained and become more durable. What we're also seeing is that organizations that are most sustainable are, and I heard the words, durability and persistence and so on. What we're seeing is that organizations that understand that this is not just a marathon, it's not just a sprint, it's not just a relay, it's all of it, all at the same time, and they organize themselves in a way where they're able to do all three things, many other things as well, but all three ways of doing things are the ones that are sustainable. Organizations that are only focused on long-term financial viability, right, on paper, are the ones who are the least sustainable organizations in terms of their missions, right? So as a whole, I would say that's where our focus on sustainability is. And one thought that came to me just reading through some of the comments on the 2016 Sustainability Index was that in our community, community of civil society development folks, we still define sustainability with a CS capital O, right? We still talk about civil society organization with a capital O sustainability. And we have to find a way for ourselves to understand how that capital O and the lowercase o of organizing civil society are actually coming together to mutually reinforce sustainability of mission, right? And so moving away from compliance-focused sustainability metrics, moving away from outside, externally defined effectiveness and impact metrics is key to understanding what makes civil society in a particular context actually sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Amy, do you have anything to add to this discussion in terms of how you view the definition of sustainability from your vantage point?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me here today, and congratulations on the study coming out. I think about these issues a lot in terms of what's happening with the civil society space in the Middle East and North Africa, not only because that's my area of expertise, but also because I've spent much of my own career working in the NGO and civil society sector. So I think I feel very aware of how difficult it is to keep effective NGOs, nonprofit organizations, civic groups going, even in our own environment here in the United States with all of its challenges and problems. We still have incredible openness and freedom and all kinds of capacities and advantages. The state of civil society in the Middle East and North Africa right now is terrible. It is true that there are a few bright spots, and there are organizations and movements that are enduring and showing their resilience. But I think in general, the pressures in this region going against sustainable civil society are more intense than any time I've seen them in the 20 plus years that I've been working on these issues. When I think about what is required, how I think about civil society's sustainability, I would say that it is really a combination of different factors, as Alex mentioned. And I think really about three main areas that all are required to be present for an organization or a movement to really be able to endure, and not just endure, but flourish and be successful, and make a difference in their communities. The first is support, and this includes financial support, which is, I very much agree with Alex's remarks, but we also know that resources and financial resources are needed to keep an organization going and growing. So support, including financial backing, financial resources, and other kinds of support from staff and from the community that is related to the community that an organization exists within. Secondly, a second factor I would say is strengths and capacity. And here I think about the resources and skills of the organization itself. The human capital of the organization is crucial. And we've all seen and worked with NGOs and civic groups in our respective regions that have been fortunate enough to receive a lot of funding, but their human capacity is outstripped by the funding that they receive, and they end up not succeeding and sometimes folding and closing. So really the human talent, the capacity, the skills is crucial to sustainability. And then third, I would say a very important factor is relevance, and this really has to do with mission. What is the mission of the organization, and does it matter to people in that community and in that country? And we know that civic organizations exist in a range of sizes. There are very large organizations, and there are organizations that are quite small and niche. And so someone's mission and relevance could be very, very, very specific, related to a very specific community or a very specific set of concerns, and that organization could still be very valuable, or it could be much broader. But if an organization, and it could be at the elite level working in very specific policy issues, or it could be an organization could be focused much more at the grassroots level. So there's all different dimensions, as I see it, of the factor of relevance or mission. But there has to be something there that speaks to people working in the organization, but also its constituency that matters in some way. And when I look at a lot of the countries in the Arab world, I see many organizations, some of which I believe are truly relevant, and a very large number of others that exist. Sometimes they're created by governments, sometimes they're created by citizens, but they don't seem to be very relevant or very meaningful, and they're not going to be sustainable. Finally, I would say that, when I look at the outside inputs that are shaping these factors, this combination of factors that I think creates sustainable civic groups, I believe that there are many, many, many factors pressing and pushing on civic groups and hindering their effectiveness and their ability to survive and endure and flourish. And we could spend a very long time talking about all of them. But in my view, the single most important factor is the hostility of Arab governments, of Arab rulers, to civic initiatives, independent civic initiatives. This issue matters more than anything else in the region. It is also these same governments that are responsible for creating the wars and the conflicts that are now ravaging several countries in the region, and of course making it very, very difficult for organizations, civic organizations, to survive and thrive. So in summary, I would say that over the last 20 years, what I've observed in the region is a growing appeal, actually, among citizens, especially young people, of the idea of civic initiatives that come from within society, from within citizens, people organizing together to take it upon themselves to address a problem, to solve a problem, to make their community and their society better. That idea is not accepted by everybody, but it is growing, and I see this as an extremely positive trend. However, the attitude of governments is badly out of step with this, and they generally across the region, in different degrees of intensity, but there is not one single government in the region, unfortunately, that has the appropriate attitude, in my view, toward these civic initiatives of all kinds, whether they have to do with improving the environment or addressing pollution or human rights issues or women's rights, a range of issues. Generally, the hostility is very pertinent, and the desire of these regimes for control, to control and sometimes squash these bottom-up initiatives is very intense. So these are the competing trends that I see, but unfortunately, overall, I would say it's negative. Yeah.
Thank you, Amy. Orisha, from your vantage point, definition of civil society sustainability, what do you see as the key points there?
Thank you, Chair. You would imagine it's very difficult for me to go the last in this quiz section. But believe me, civil sustainability is such a broad concept that I have a couple of points to add, and I must say I agree with most of what my co-panelists said. The way I've always looked at and worked in civil society was to focus on impact. And for me, civil society sustainability is a capacity to deliver a meaningful impact for a group of citizens united around the common goal. And I think here very much connect to what Amy said about the relevance and about the added value. And I think this is the story civil society has to tell. What is the added value that those groups are bringing to the society? And when you look at the impact, there's a couple of indicators that you can look at. And for example, when I look at civil society in my region, I look at quality of leadership, I look at governance, I look at their legitimacy, and this is linked to relevance. You know, who do they represent? Who is their constituency? And I look at something that is important is capacity to adapt, because, you know, we have uncertain environment in our title of the session. You know, believe me, everywhere today environment is uncertain. In the United States, in Ukraine, you know, in Africa and in the Middle East. I mean, to a various degree, and this uncertainty is different, but nowhere there's certainty. And it's also something that I find crucially important for sustainability is to be solution-oriented. And when civil society incubates something in its, through its work, this could have a follow-up as sustainability through institution. This can be taken over by the government and replicated, or it can be taken over by the market and replicated. So the interaction between civil society and institutions is very important and often very painful from the region where I come from. But it has another interaction, which is the adjective civil in the word society. And I think we often forget, perhaps with the nature of the work, especially around the USAID model, the adjective of how civil our societies are, how tolerant, how empathetic citizens are. And I think this is crucially important in looking at sustainability for those organizations, because if societies will be hostile, aggressive, radical, it will be very difficult for them to be sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you. So it really gives us a much broader sense of how the definition of civil society and sustainability is evolving in general, but also more specifically in various regions. So thank you very much for that. Let me now turn very quickly to the individual questions for each of you. What I'm going to ask you to do is to spend no more than 2 minutes, because we really want to get to the engagement with the audience here, who bring some of the expertise and the more difficult and niggly questions that we might want to get to. So let me start with you first, Alex. Given your work on civil society development around the world, particularly in Africa and Asia, how would you define agency for civil society organizations, and what are your recommendations for maximizing civil society agency in programming? And why does agency matter, actually?
Sure. I think, if I may just tweak the question just a little bit, because I think agency in programming implies that implies an external purpose for civil society. And what we want to, and this is the crux of the issue, that civil society, when citizens organize, they have to define their own purpose, their own metrics of success. They have to define their own culture of engagement. And I would absolutely agree that sometimes the best civil society organizations that seem to be successful are the most autocratically run civil society organizations, which is a problem. So what we wanna do is we wanna make sure that CSOs, programmatically speaking, when we work with organizations or movements, that we're working with ones that are grounded in their own understanding of who they are and why they are, right? And so that actually is the entirety of definition for us in terms of agency, because what we see based on our data is when organizations do that, they are able to move away from only looking at funding streams as a purpose. They are able to move away from delivering for the satisfaction of donors, for vertically managing up, and they actually start meeting expectations flowing down to communities and their constituents. That's how it's coming through our research. And maximizing impact through agency. Again, a lot of times we make the mistakes, and this is, I'm being self-critical here as well. It's not just pointing the finger. We tend to want to define what success looks like for others, especially if you're in the game of giving grants, right? This is a big deal. We set the success metric for others, and that is where we go wrong. That's where we go off the rails. It has to be a conversation with the civil society actors in a particular context for us together to define what success looks like. It may be that in the end, the donor walks away and says, I'm not going to spend my money here, which is absolutely fine. That's their prerogative. But if civil society is to be sustainable and to have agency for purposes of impact, that's the conversation that needs to take place.
Thank you, Alex. Let me turn to you, Orisa, for your first of a couple of questions. You noted in your recent piece within the Chatham House report that Ukraine impresses observers as the most emancipated polity, and its citizens are ready to rise up for their rights against authority. And indeed, civil society in Ukraine is often viewed as an aspirational model for other countries in that region. We are now nearly 4 years post-revolution of dignity, and one of the most significant results is the emergence of an exceptionally vibrant voluntary sector. Could you talk a little bit more about this new sector, and most importantly, how traditional civil society organizations are engaging with volunteers and building on their momentum? And then additionally to that, as you think about that very big question, we are also seeing from Ukraine that civil society organizations can have a significant impact on the reform process. And so in your experience, which tools have been the most effective, and what kind of lessons are we learning from Ukraine, if any?
Well, these are two big questions.
I
Can I get
know.
4 minutes?
I'll give you 2.5.
Okay, 2.5. Okay,
Yes.
well then it's just briefly. And thank you so much for mentioning the report. Actually, I have it here. It's fully available online. It's called Struggle for Ukraine. It's just been released months ago. What happened in Ukraine after Euromaidan or the Revolution of Dignity was even during the protest was a tremendous civic mobilization and solidarity and trust among citizens who felt that their hope for future in the form of European association was stolen. And of course, the further aggression of Russia exposed the unpreparedness of the state, to deal with war. So what Ukrainians have done, as some people call it, real war for independence, they've basically self-organized into voluntary associations to provide much necessary services and material for Ukrainian armed forces. For some of them were at that time volunteer battalions, for families affected by the conflict, and for millions, actually 1.5 million of internally displaced Ukrainians who had to flee either from Crimea or from occupied east of Ukraine. And this new segment of civil society substantially expanded, the variety of actors within civil society, because what we had before was mostly, traditional Western-funded NGOs and some community foundations and some private charitable foundations. And citizen engagement in those groups was, weak. I mean, at about 10%, you would say. With emergence of those very much, patriotic sector, you could also call it, almost 40% Ukrainians donated funding, which is huge when you think about it. But also, they have the highest level of trust of all institutions. If you compare 56% 53% trust. Voluntary associations, volunteers as they are called, even like individualized, I am a volunteer, so I trust volunteer, versus 9% trust government. So that's a huge, and what they've done, and I think it's an interesting lesson learned from Ukraine, is that some of those famous volunteers who were doing paramedical assistant, who were doing military assistant, they joined government. Some became deputy ministers of defense, some now acting health ministers, and they landed their dividend of trust to authorities that came on this social mobilization, and they served a very important stabilizing role in Ukraine's painful transition. So some of those organizations emerged around veterans now, there are around 300 new, some around IDPs, some around children affected by the conflict, and it also was prompted also by the inflow of Western assistance. They had to register and institutionalize themselves to be able to bid for grants and projects. So now, on your second question about, it's interesting which tools in the current political culture, and Ukraine's political culture is similar to other post-Soviet post-totalitarian countries to a various degree, of course. But we have to always remember that CSO sector is not working in a silo, and it's directly impacted by the quality of institutions, by level of trust, by professionalism, by elite. We notice in Ukraine that what was amazing at the beginning, right after the revolution, as I said, government came because of the social protests. So they wanted to include civil society as much as possible. And you could see very interesting participation. For example, selection of all anti-corruption bureaus heads was with participation of civil society. Political parties invited civil society leaders to run for offices. Public Integrity Council was set up with civil society to vet all the judges. Police recruitment was happening because of with participation. National Reform Council was set up. That was the beginning. They needed them as partners. But then, of course, there was an evolution of the relations. As each incumbent wants to keep power, the civil society becomes a threat. And and we come back to the vicious cycle of really identifying the role for civil society, role for political society, role for market and business. And what is a warning sign to me right now, and in the report I've surveyed over 160 organizations to ask them which tools are most effective if they want to achieve change. And number one, they say it's sharing information with media, is to put pressure on the current government. Number two is basically bring people to the street, protest, direct action, mobilizing to exert public pressure. And only 9% believe that public hearings, for example, are effective. It shows you tension that is embedded in the current political system, where civil society actors feel they have no counterpart. Nobody listens to them. They immediately have to go to the street. And this is the risk, in the region, that we always come back to this politics of the square to make citizens heard. And unless, and then this is something we mentioned in our report, the future of Ukraine very much depends on the transformation of relations between state, citizens, and business. Unless we really find the model without the conflict to coexist and to feel meaningful, this relation, I think Ukraine, the future of Ukraine and countries in the region that are going through a similar change will be very turbulent. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Arisa. Let me turn to you, Amy, with your question. In the 2 years that you spent at the State Department, you helped coordinate U.S. support for Egypt's transition. The period since has been tumultuous for Egyptian civil society, I think reaching a critical low point with the passage of a repressive law on civil society organizations this past summer. So what has that experience taught to you about civil society organizations navigating or trying to navigate political transitions? And what have been the most and least effective CSO adaptations for enduring such dramatically closing spaces and environments?
Thank you. Right now, the situation in Egypt is terrible. There has never been such a hostile and repressive environment for civil society organizations of all kinds, I would say, since the dictatorship of Gamal Abdel Nasser, who really didn't recognize the concept of civic organizations or NGOs at all. Today in Egypt, the Egyptian government pays lip service to the concept of NGOs because of what's developed around the globe and in international discourse and foreign aid over the past 30 to 40 years. They now pay lip service to the concept of NGOs, but organizations of all kinds, whether they work on human rights or on seemingly less political issues having to do with development and charity, they are all under intense pressure. So I don't have too many positive lessons to highlight, but I would mention a couple for this entire space sector that is under intense siege. Basically, the Egyptian government currently really only sees NGOs as legitimate actors if they are organizations of citizens that are carrying out work based on the government's own agenda, under their direction, under their funding, and under their control, which in my view completely sort of obliterates the concept of civil society. In my view, there has to be some measure of independence. It doesn't mean that organizations need to be adversarial or conflictual with the regime, but they need to operate with some amount of independence. Otherwise, they're not a civic organization. So organizations that do not want to work under that sort of yoke of repression and control, I'll just mention two types. For the independent human rights community, which is the Sisi regime is determined to obliterate, to extinguish, to eradicate through a variety of measures, I would say that those organizations, those human rights groups that are still existing in this environment of intense hostility, the people who work in them are incredibly dedicated and extremely brave. And because their lives are on the line. I mean, if they could go to prison for the rest of their lives, actually, if they're found guilty in this current investigation that the Egyptian regime is carrying out against them. And let's be honest, I mean, just like in every society, some people are entrepreneurs and some people want to work in, a big existing company. Not everyone has that level of dedication and bravery. It really requires a lot to put on the line for your own security, your family's security, because they're also going after people's families, friends. So those who are still persisting in this intense environment are incredibly dedicated to the cause of human rights, and they're incredibly brave. They are very, very, very brave. And we've seen that actually there are not a small number of these people who are willing to try to do what they think is right during this period. They also tell me that they benefit tremendously, not just from local solidarity, and they do have some, but also from international solidarity. The different kinds of support that they have received from the international community, from NGOs, from governments, are vital, absolutely vital to helping them continue and persist. Then there's a different set of organizations that I think have tried to continue in this environment by working on issues that have maybe a broader resonance in Egyptian society than certain kinds of human rights violations, which sometimes are seen by some as only affecting a certain part of the society. But for example, the issue of sexual harassment of women, that takes place, like in the streets and on public transportation, is something that affects a lot of different women in different parts of Egypt, of different social classes. And so some organizations have been able to work on this issue, and they've really sort of struck a nerve in a positive way. This is something that really matters to huge numbers of Egyptian women. Everyone can identify with it. It's very, very frustrating. It affects people's daily lives. And I would say that those organizations have been impressive in their adaptability. So far, they haven't had much success in changing laws and policies, but they have had success in raising awareness. And I really commend them for their work.
Thank you. This is a really rich discussion, and we obviously picked the right people to be here because I'm learning so much, and it's really interesting to me to pick on lessons from across the globe, different parts of the world, but also hearing the very different perspectives. So unfortunately, our time is diminishing, and I really do want to bring the audience in. So here's what I'm going to do. And I'm sure some of what you have to say will come up in the Q&A with the participants. But I'd like to do this. Let me just very quickly give you a minute each just to answer this question. Amy, you just talked about the really dire situation in Egypt. Could you look at Tunisia and say, that's one of the areas where there have been some successes in the civil society space. Are there any lessons that we could take from the Tunisian experience that perhaps we could share, not just in North Africa, but with other parts of the world? What are one or two that you would identify as perhaps?
Sure, that's an excellent question. Thank you for mentioning Tunisia. I would say there are two features of the Tunisian situation that have contributed to its relatively vibrant, active, and resilient civil society. The first is that under the dictatorship, which lasted for several decades, although the many organizations were repressed and the heads and leadership of many big national level NGOs had been co-opted, it turned out that during the dictatorship, especially say in the last 10 years of the Ben Ali regime, underneath that top layer, there was some remaining institutional memory, independence of the people inside those organizations that wasn't necessarily visible from the outside, but as soon as the uprising started and the political environment opened up dramatically, almost exactly 6 years ago, it turns out that those people kind of emerged. And so this is an important lesson for those of us who work on countries where there are authoritarian regimes and dictatorships. There are sometimes even within these organizations that seem very co-opted. The Tunisian Bar Association is one example. Well, it turns out that underneath that layer of sort of ossified leadership, there were young and vibrant and very democratically minded bar association members who sprang into action when given the chance during the uprising. So this is actually something quite positive. The second lesson from Tunisia, I would say, is that Tunisia, despite all of its problems and struggles, is a democratizing country. And the political environment there is quite free, although there are many, many challenges and some negative signs coming from the current government about its attitude towards civil society. In general, the environment is very free. And that is why civil society is thriving and flourishing, because it exists in a free environment. And so this is the lesson, that when political space opens up, civil society will open up to fill it. So we hope the same for other countries.
Thank you, Amy. Alex, turning to you. I know you said not to define sustainability in the context of financial resources, but you do have a very, very strong background in terms of working with different donors, including the US government, European partners, but also the private sector, in engaging in this space. So from your perspective, what do you see as some of the funding models that can drive innovation and new ways of registering impact?
Mm-hmm. So, two quick things. One of the most successful, one of the most difficult, first let's say, and most successful examples of innovative funding models has been an effort that Civicus has been involved with Counterpart International, funded by USAID and Swedish SIDA, the Innovation for Change Initiative. And I'm looking at Miriam, who's been involved. We've grown old together on this thing. In the beginning, it was as Gretchen mentioned, it was a agency-wide, broad agency announcement and a co-creation process, which meant nothing was defined at the onset. Everything was co-created, everything was co-planned, everything was uncertain at all points of the process, continues to be, okay? Because while we cocoon ourselves into a process of feeling comfortable with uncertainty, there are governments, there are funders, there are activists who are continuing on a continuum that they need to be on. And so trying to tweak models, funding models from bilateral donors to include, whether you call them implementers, whether you call them beneficiaries, whether you call them CSOs who are going to receive grants, to include those actors in the process, making sure that they know that this is not a guarantee for funding, but it is an effort together to actually define what success is, and then opening up the resourcing and the funding into that. A second one, which I would be remiss not to mention, has nothing to do with money. It has everything to do with essential resources like expertise, like human capital, and so on, that is taking off as part of the innovation initiative in Latin America. And I'm happy that Gerardo Torres is here, a teammate of mine who has been working on this, called the sharing economy of CSOs, which is essentially a platform to barter expertise, skills, without there ever needing to be financial transactions between organizations. And this is an essential model in Latin America where for decades now, civil society development has been going on. And while funding has been important, the lack and access to expertise is something that they've been complaining about. So 2 examples that where we've been successful.
Fantastic, thank you. This is brain food going on here for me. So, Arisa, let me come to you for your last 1 minute here, and see if you can talk a little bit about civil society sustainability in the Eurasia sub-region, which is one of the lowest in the index. In fact, many of the countries in that region appear at the sustainability impeded category. So could you talk to us about how you see organizations working in more restrictive countries continuing to operate and engage with citizens in such environments where that space is rapidly constricting?
Well, that's a $6 million question. I think we're all trying to figure out how can we work in restrictive or semi-restrictive. I think semi-restrictive is easy, and some of those examples from Tunisia where you have partial democracy, not yet consolidated democracies, but already, giving some space is easier. But for example, if you think about Belarus or Azerbaijan in our region, in particularly difficult. So these are just a couple of propositions, right? It may be interesting to hear your view. I think I would propose to focus on the key function of civil society as a convening power for citizens, and rather than advocacy and policy change. And focus on empowerment of citizens to deliver services without the state, despite the state, no matter what the state does. Because if we're talking about Eurasia, it's a post-totalitarian, post-colonial, even if you wish, societies. And paternalism is very high. I mean, citizens all the time look to the state. So for them, it's already a revolutionary change to think that they can take care of their own condominiums, communities, communal parks, I don't know, kindergarten education. And I think there could be a variety of very interesting projects that I think would be viewed as less political by authorities, such as focused on education, and something that I mentioned in the first intervention about the civil part of civil society and how do we nurture the future, empathetic civil citizens, because, let's be honest, these places, they be like incubation, right? This is a process of incubation for future democracy. I think it's very important to measure expectations when we start intervention. I mean, even look at what is now expected from Ukraine. We have such high expectations. We have to be really careful about how we do it. So, a few other, concrete ideas why I think it's possible to work. It's around community development, youth engagement, environment. So issues that are very close to the skin, even assistance to elderly and vulnerable groups, culture. And, and I think something key that's now social science is showing is that in order to drive social change, the norm of behavior, we need to build common knowledge. And there have been experiments that show that when you bring citizens together and share information on whatever it is, it's more effective than each individually receives or downloads the information from online, because people see that their neighbors know the same information. And it somehow surprisingly triggers eventually the change of behavior. And this is what we're after here. Over time, we want to trigger behavioral change. And I like to quote Karl Popper, who said, democracy may help preserve freedom, but it will never create it if individual citizens do not care about it. So think about that.
Thank you so much. That's a very powerful note on which to end and for us to really think through why we do this and why this matters. Let me now open it up we have a few minutes. So I have mics in the corners over there. So what we're going to do is if you would like to raise a question, ask a question or make a comment, please raise your hand. I'll acknowledge you. Somebody will bring your mic. You'll have 30 seconds. to make your comment or ask your question, identify the speaker to whom you are directing your question. I'll take 3 at a time, give the panel an opportunity to respond, and then we'll take another round. So the floor is open. Ooh, I see a lot of hands go up. So let me just start here and I'll work my way back if you don't mind. I'll start with the gentleman over here, then the gentleman next to him, and then the lady right there. So 30 seconds, sir, and I'm really good with my red cards.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. How are you able to use the internet to get the outfits together and raise the funding and coordinate things and get some transparency?
Thank you, sir.
Hi, my name is Gerardo Torres, and I just wanted to mention the sharing economy and something really important that is happening in Latin America. Like the region has realized that without trust, there is no sustainability. So that's the key issue that the region has identified. So they want people to trust them because, as you mentioned, in Ukraine, there is trust. In Latin America, there isn't. The last report shows that only 17% of Latin Americans trust in a third party, which is important.
In a political party?
In a third party, in others, right? Which is important, and this is the key, how we can share resources, how we can guarantee that civil society organizations are inserted and are able to build communities where people can exchange knowledges. And this is especially important in attracting volunteers. The philanthropic culture is really weak. And right now, CSOs are looking at the example of Techo, which is like the most successful NGO in Latin America in attracting volunteers, which mobilizes 500,000 volunteers each year. And we had the opportunity to ask the director last week in Fiji, what do you do? And he told us, well, we sell our volunteers a dream that they can change the world by volunteering with us. So that's a reflection I wanted to make. Thanks.
Thank you. There's a lady right behind you. Thank you.
Hi, Lana Beidas from CSIS. My question is actually it's directed toward how to build legitimacy of civil society. And this has been a point of concern that we grapple with in terms of how to address the connectivity with the local constituency and how the civil society needs to approach their local population. And my second point, I know, but it's just like I'm here, I'm trying, but we need to learn from the experience of Latin America in terms of sharing expertise. What were the parameter for success? Why it happened? Latin America did not been replicated in other regions. Thank you very much for your generosity.
Thank you. All right, so I'll turn it over to the panel. You don't have to answer all 3 questions. Just pick one on about a minute. Just how we can better use the internet as a tool to facilitate CSO sustainability, talking about building trust, which at the end of the day is really what underpins some of what's going on in terms of the challenges that CSOs face and the way that CSOs are evolving. How do you address that lack of trust? And then building legitimacy and stronger connectivity with the local communities and constituencies that they serve. So let me start with Amy, come to Alex, and then you, Oricia. Just pick one.
Sure. I'll respond to your question about the internet. The internet is very important in the Middle East and North Africa. I can speak to that for information sharing and sometimes for mobilizing citizens, either through formal civic organizations or through broader civil movements. Of course, it's just one tool and it can't do everything, but it is actually a very important tool, which is why many Arab governments are seeking new ways to control this space because they understand the potential that it represents, and in my view, they fear it. And so they are actually trying to counteract its potential by increasing surveillance, control, criminal penalties for people. In the case of Egypt, there's a proposed law to penalize certain kinds of postings on social media. People have already been sent to prison for pro-democracy posts on social media. So it is a tool, but one that I think remains vulnerable because of its power.
Absolutely, and just to add on to that, we had one of our interns today do a presentation on the phenomenon of internet shutdowns by governments in Africa. So it is an increasing tactic that governments are using that threatens the ability for us to use this tool. Alex?
So let me take the legitimacy building trust sort of combo. 73% of successful movements, particularly women's and youth movements, don't trust CSOs. This is across the globe in our research. That's unbelievable. Okay, so if we have colleagues, partners in our own sector that don't trust us, things aren't looking too good. So, one of the things that we're sort of passionately advocating for is greater accountability in CSOs, but not. We don't want to. Governments will take that line and say, yes, absolutely, greater accountability. So let me audit you, right? And that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is accountability to communities, to purported constituents that we say we serve, and the process of actually showing how we're accountable. So using data, using feedback loops from communities, from constituent groups to actually say, we are doing what we're doing, and yes, we are failing sometimes, and we're learning from those failures. And what I mentioned early on, storytelling, really telling our story, which is essentially the story of those we serve in a more humane and human way, so that a broader audience can understand it.
Thank you.
I would like to add on legitimacy. I think I agree with you that it has to be accountability. But what I noticed in the former Soviet region, in particularly, there's a certain resentment toward membership. People believe, oh, it's like Soviet-style pioneers and Komsomol. We're not going to even try. We're not even try. And I think it's a mistake because there's no internal accountability. Nobody can fire basically a CSO of the head of the NGO for bad performance or for damaging, an image of an organization or even mismanagement of funds. And I think this is a problem when you are, not walking the talk, when you're demanding transparency and accountability from government, and you as a CSO yourself is not accountable and transparent. And I know in Ukraine we've tried to introduce something that worked in Denmark, for example, was the popular account. Because I think as CSOs themselves are not reaching out to engage, to develop volunteers, to develop individual donations, even small, and these donations can be in kind, and to run stakeholder consultations. The question is very often that the stakeholders are very broad. They would say, we serve youth, or we serve democracy, or we serve human rights, and that's very broad. That's why they cannot tell their story, because it's such a broad story that it doesn't connect to a human individual need, and I think this could be done. And I'm proud to say that some of Latin American experiences now that are developing in Ukraine with participatory budgeting. And participatory budgeting was big in Latin America, and right now 40 cities in Ukraine, because of fiscal decentralization, putting it's small amount, is like 1% of a city budget for communities to vote online for projects. And it's a symbolic thing that really, I think citizens feel they have a stake, right? That they are deciding something. And I think our societies will be much more sustainable and resilient if citizens feel they are part of the system, not outside of the system. And we know how it can turn out.
All right, thank you. Let me take just very quickly, 30 seconds. I'm going to time it this time. All right, I'll start in the back. I'll go over there, come over here, and then I'm going to work it down. Can you please get him the mic, the gentleman in the back? Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much. My question is for all of you. Yeah, I am Aswad Jabbar from Voice of America, journalist and writer, and I work with the civil society like 15 years in Iraq and Kurdistan region. Yeah, when you talk about the civil society in the Middle East, you forget to talk about the big health of civil society and NGOs in the region, especially Iran and Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Iraq. All those countries is a big help for journalists, is a big help for civil societies. And the other problem is before ISIS and after ISIS and during the ISIS, you know, the Islamic extremism is the main enemy for the Islamic extremism or Islamic ideologies. Extremism in the Middle East is civil society organization and activists and journalists. How's your opinion about those kind of situations, especially about civil society in Iran and civil society in Iraq and Turkey and other countries? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman over here, please.
Thank you very much. Excellent panel. Paul Miller, Lutheran World Relief. I don't think I've heard mention of religious actors, so religious leaders, congregations, faith-inspired organizations. Are they part of civil society? Do they help sustainability? Are they part of the problem? Probably depends. My experience in Brazil right after the dictatorship was the Catholic Church had created an umbrella to protect some of these nascent organizations, and once a new constitution was in place, these organizations indeed did a lot. But I'm wondering, what is your perspective? I was thinking the Middle East, but also, Amy, other parts of the world.
Sure. Thank you, and I think there was somebody here. Did I miss? Oh, there's a lady right here, sorry.
Martha Wojciechowski-Chomiak, a historian. I was very impressed with your presentations, and I have one question. I suppose it would be most directed to Orisha, but also to you. Many of you and your organizations are domiciled in one country, but are working with another country. Do you find that to be a particular burden, or how do you resolve the issue?
All right, we have another question. I'll take that and then turn it over to. Oh, fantastic. All right. Everybody's satisfied. I like that. So, three very good questions and comments. The first one about delving a little bit deeper into Iran, Iraq, and Turkey, and what sort of things stand out there given the unique situations in those countries. And I think Afghanistan was also one of them. I talked a little bit about ISIS and media issues. So there's some things you can share about those countries or that block of countries that would be really useful. And then, is there anything that stands out about the role of religious actors in civil society, whether positive or negative, that would be helpful or bring some added value to this discussion? Is another thing that we wanted to talk about. And then sort of navigating distance. As you work on your various missions and the pros and cons of being, whether you are headquartered in London or you're headquartered in Washington, and yet you are working on the ground in Africa or in Asia or Fiji, as we were talking about earlier on. What are some of the pros and cons of that sort of engagement and process of working on these issues that you're working on? So again, just pick one. I'm going to give you, I know we're at exactly 3 o'clock, so I'll give you a minute each. Alex.
All right.
All right. And then I'll come to you, Orisa.
Physical space, physical concentration. It's interesting because that is at the crux of how civil society organizations are going to survive for the next decade, 2 decades, versus not. The challenge is that today's world is networked through telecommunications. And so space, physical space and physical proximity, as much as it makes it easier to do our work, is not central to our work anymore. But that also means that organizational culture and organizational models have to adapt to that reality, right? And so one of the things we're doing, and in fact we're doing with the innovation initiative, the Innovation for Change initiative, is really opening up that question and understanding how are we going to diffuse ourselves as civil society organizations and really think of a playing field that is flat, that includes north, south, east, and west, and where we can actually leverage resources and talent and capacity to have the greatest amount of impact. So moving away from the hard boundaries of an organization, a city, and a state.
Thank you, Alex. I dare say this is where your issue about ensuring that you're not usurping the agency of the organizations that you're working with in far out places also comes in. So I'm glad you raised those two points. Let me come to you, Orisa, and then I'll.
Thank you. I actually believe that religious organizations and charities are part of civil society. Absolutely. I think they are, in Ukraine's case, serve a very important charitable purpose of assisting vulnerable. And even Ukrainian church leaders, they actually spoken prominently against corruption. And the source of change has to come from an individual, and then can only then drive the kind of institutions that we want to see, so they are sustainable, so they are not just a blueprint from Brussels or Washington. And I think was interesting to observe in Ukraine's religious community is that they justified why they support European integration of Ukraine because of the principles on which European civilization is built. And those principles, the religious leaders said, are inherently part of their religions. But, for example, the Russian Orthodox Church played a very different role. And, you know, if that's of interest to you, there was a paper I've written on the agents of the Russian world, where you see Russian church playing a very much a state function, and unfortunately of destabilizing the region. So it depends on the religion, like you said. And on the distance, I think it's there are, of course, pros and cons. I mean, I'm blessed that I can travel to Ukraine and meet the people. But I think it's while being away, and it's such a moving picture, and there are so many new actors that are emerging, it's very important to have good sources and to kind of be able to see snow worms in the iceberg, so to say, because these little snow worms in the iceberg can eventually play an important role. And I think that going beyond capitals, this is something, especially in countries like Ukraine, that is a big country. You cannot really feel the pulse of the country just being in the capital, and you have to go outside. And that way you see the scale and the diversity of needs. And, you know, I think it's important to keep in mind civil society is super diverse. You know, it should not be one. I mean, there are some guiding rules and principles, but it's a rainbow. It's a very, very diverse sector. That's why it's so fascinating.
Thank you. Amy, bring us home.
Thank you. Excellent questions, all of them. Regarding religious organizations, are they part of civil society? Yes, I very much agree. They are a critical part of civil society. The important factor, though, is whether they espouse tolerance and democratic values. Because in my view, civil society is actually not inherently democratic. It's a zone of civic organization and citizen mobilization that exists outside, separate from the state. But it can be anti-democratic or pro-democratic. So in our own country, for example, generally religious and faith-based organizations are a hugely important part of the strength and resilience of our own civil society. But I think it's because to a very great extent, the values that they're inculcating and espousing in people, no matter what the faith, are very much connected to our own democratic values. And they play a big role in our own democratic society. But that could also, in the US in the future, or in other countries, they could play a very, very, very negative and anti-democratic role. With regard to Iran and Turkey and Iraq, in Iran and Turkey, independent civil society is under siege constantly. In Iran, this is an old story. In Turkey, it's an old story, then it got better, and now we're back to intensely closing space. In Turkey, a NATO member, the impact of the authoritarianism that is unfolding, especially after last summer's attempted coup, is intense. Iraq is a very complex picture, as you know from spending time there, but there are actually some, I would say, encouraging signs and some really resilient Iraqi civil society actors in different parts of the country. So in a strange way, I would put Iraq in a different category than Iran and Turkey at the moment. And finally, regarding your excellent question about distance, my own organization is based in Washington, D.C. We have 18 civil society partners across the Middle East and North Africa. This is actually one part of our mission is to work with them, and we're in sort of constant communication with them, but there are definitely challenges that are posed by the distance. We now have an office in Tunisia, and Tunisia serves as a hub for all those organizations to come and gather together. And we hope that Tunisia remains an open space where people from across the region can actually come and meet freely with one another in the region with their American colleagues and guests if they would like us there, or just on their own. So this is actually a positive thing that there's now a place in the region where they can meet with relatively little interference.
But I think, sorry to interrupt, distance can also give more clarity.
Okay. That's a good and powerful point. Thank you. So let me, look, we could go on. This has been a fantastic, fantastic panel, and I thank you all. But let me just say this. Mariam, to you and your team at USAID and the other partners who continue to do this work on the index, I cannot thank you enough for this work. This is a space that is under threat from so many different corners. In many parts of the world, it's a question of life and death for people, literally. And so we thank you for the work that you continue to do to help put the spotlight on this issue and to frame the issues in a way that allows us to actually engage in a way that might be able to bring about change and keep that space open. Ms. Burkle, can't thank you enough for your leadership. And thank you so much for coming here. We have been watching the leadership over at USAID, and I know I speak for many within Washington, but also in various regions of the world who have been concerned that USAID continues to remain focused on this issue, that it is so critical, and the backsliding that we see is something that USAID has helped fix in the past, and we hope that USAID will continue to do the good work that is so necessary, and we thank you for your leadership in that space. To our speakers, whether you sit in a government organization or you sit in a private organization or a CSO organization or a think tank, we thank you also for the work that you do. I think the passion and the commitment that you bring to this issue was evident in the remarks that you had to share with all of us. I know I learned a lot. I just came from an African think tank and CSO meeting. It was quite depressing in some ways. This has been reassuring to me to some extent and actually reinforced that we're all in this together. There's a favorite African saying of mine, which is, a child who has not traveled thinks his mother's cooking is the best. What this session did right here today for me was just to enable us to share not just the struggles, but also the good practices and perhaps different ways of doing things to achieve that result that we are all looking for. So I thank our speakers for not just focusing on the challenges, but also looking at the positives that we can take and try to amplify, but also domesticate to different regions. To the USA team that worked with us, my colleagues at the Wilson Center, but most importantly, all of you who are in this room, you came here because of your commitment to this issue. So I thank you for the work that you continue to do, and I hope what you are taking away is a little bit of what I am taking away. Knowledge of what's going on in other regions, but a recommitment to the fact that we have work to do in this space. So I thank you all for coming, and I want to ask you to join me in thanking all of our speakers for a good job. And then we have some time to share drinks out in the hallway, so please join us so we can continue to mix and mingle and continue the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.